The storm began with a pink envelope folded like a warning flare. It lay under the doormat, damp at the edges, stamped with a case number and a balance due that felt invented out of thin air. The accusation was oddly specific. My mailbox stood at an improper height in violation of a new aesthetic uniformity standard. 30 days to comply, $50 a day after that. Accrued interest. Administrative fees. Final line in bold, like the punchline to a bad joke. Foreclosure may be initiated for unpaid assessments and fines. By sunset, the neighborhood pulsed with quiet panic. Identical envelopes had landed like hail. Neighbors stood at the curb comparing measurements with tape and guesswork, squinting at wood posts that had not moved an inch in a decade. A few had already paid a local contractor the HOA recommended, $350 for an approved mailbox post and a laminated compliance card. The contractor's truck made slow loops like a shark that knew dinner was served. On paper, the president framed it as beautification. In practice, it felt like a cash funnel, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, pointed straight at the board. The newsletter praised safety, consistency, and property values, the familiar trinity invoked whenever someone needed silence more than consent. Buried in the fine print, a brand new height rule, expressed as a range that did not match any federal postal guidance I had ever read. I walked the sidewalk with a notepad, the way I always do when something doesn't add up. Every mailbox carried the soft history of the people who lived beside it. Sun-faded flags, small dents from bicycles, hand-painted house numbers. None of them looked dangerous. All of them looked expensive to replace. Inside, I spread the notice on the kitchen table, flattening creases with my palm. The letterhead was correct. The tone was familiar. The citations were vague. The rule referenced architectural standards adopted by the board, but no date, no amendment number, no recording information in the county archives. It asked homeowners to comply without showing them the rule they were supposed to follow. I measured my mailbox anyway, 44 inches from ground to the bottom of the box. The sweet spot I remembered from the postal manual. I wrote the number down, then wrote down the time, then photographed the tape and the base from 3 angles. Because evidence is just memory with a backbone. The envelope threatened a hearing in 2 weeks, described as a courtesy before escalation. I circled the date and pulled the binder where I keep neighborhood paperwork. Covenants, conditions, restrictions, bylaws, operating rules. A stack of minutes that never seemed to explain as much as they recorded. The pages smelled like dry cardboard and ink, the scent of governance in suburban America. The president's signature on the notice was quick and slanted, as if the pen wanted out. I stared at that line for a long time, thinking about how people sign their power without reading it. Then I did what I always do when the ground under a threat feels unstable. I asked for the ground. I prepared a written request for every governing document, every architectural guideline, every adoption date, every board vote, every meeting notice, and every homeowner ballot related to mailbox standards. Certified mail, return receipt requested, deadline demanded by statute. No rancor, no show. Just the quiet pressure of rules applied to people who claim to live by them. The letter slid into the blue postal box with a soft clink that sounded like a match striking in the dark. Tomorrow would bring a tracking number, then a signature, then a timer the board could not stop. The neighborhood slept under the new threat like a dog under thunder, ears pricked. I set my alarm for early and left the binder open on the table. In the morning, I would start counting. The tracking page lit green. Delivered, signed for at 10:14 a.m. A clock began ticking in my head, the statutory window for inspection and production. Boards love power until they meet timelines. I cleaned the kitchen counters, because the waiting hours go faster when hands are busy. Then cleared a space for the paper storm I knew was coming. The first reply was not paper but a tone, sent by email through the community portal. The manager acknowledged my request with the polished vagueness of a pre-recorded message. Documents would be compiled. Thank you for your patience. No list of what existed, no schedule for inspection. I saved the message as Exhibit A and replied with a politely sharpened reminder. The documents were not favors. They were rights, and the deadline was not optional. 3 days later, a cardboard banker's box arrived at the clubhouse, labeled with my name in black marker. The attendant handed it over with the theatrics of a vault transfer. Inside, I found bylaws with coffee stains, CC&Rs with marginalia from a decade of board members, Photocopied architectural guidelines that had been revised in 2016, 2019, and, interestingly, not at all in 2025. The most current mailbox standard I could locate simply required compliance with USPS specifications and harmony with community character. No height range. No brand mandate. No compulsory contractor. I made a second pile of meeting minutes. The board's adoption of the new rule existed only as a note appended to a December holiday meeting, recorded as passed by consensus. Attendance showed 3 of 7 directors present. Quorum not achieved. No member vote. No mailed notice. No recorded amendment. The line that mattered sat alone on a page like a confession. The Architectural Committee will finalize details. The committee, it turned out from a separate roster, had 2 members. One was the president's cousin. The other shared a last name with the recommended contractor. I kept reading until the afternoon shadows turned the pages gray. Financial statements revealed a sudden spike in compliance fee revenue and referral allowances. An attachment described a bulk rate deal with a single vendor for mailbox posts. Homeowners who paid directly were credited convenience savings. In plain terms, money flowed when fear did. I laid a ruler across 3 printed photos of the approved mailbox to confirm a suspicion growing at the base of my spine. The design stood taller than mine by a full foot, pushing the bottom of the box above the federal window. The HOA had elevated aesthetics past the mail carrier's reach. The timeline formed itself on the legal pad. January, whispers about mailbox blight at an open forum. February, contractor brochure distributed at the clubhouse. March, pink envelopes and daily fines. April, foreclosure threat language added to compliance notices. The scam was not clever. It was confident. I drafted a list of exhibits and numbered the pages. Exhibit 1, governing documents. Exhibit 2, minutes showing lack of quorum. Exhibit 3, financials indicating referral income. Exhibit 4, USPS domestic mail manual excerpt on approved heights. Exhibit 5, photographs with measurements. Exhibit 6, emails and newsletters. Exhibit 7, architectural roster revealing related parties. Evidence does not need to shout. It needs to stack. The clubhouse closed at 6. I returned the box and signed the checkout sheet, then photographed the signature line with the date and time visible. Chain of custody is the spine of any paper trail, even in a neighborhood dispute. On the walk home, porch lights clicked on like a slow applause. Across the street, an elderly couple wrestled with a level and a tape measure, trying to coax the air into agreeing with a number. I waved and kept moving, holding my questions like cards against my chest. There would be a time to involve everyone. First, I needed one more piece of the puzzle: the money. The board had built a revenue stream on top of a rule that did not exist. To turn off the tap, I would have to show where the pipe entered the house. Numbers convince where outrage exhausts. I started with a spreadsheet and a pot of coffee, then walked house to house with a gentle pretext, clarifying addresses for a neighborhood directory that no one had asked for in years. People opened doors because I never mentioned the board first. They mentioned it for me. By noon, I had 15 entries: dates of notices, amounts paid for posts, copies of receipts, and the contractor's business card, which appeared in 3 slightly different designs, as if the company enjoyed reinventing itself to stay ahead of complaints. A pattern emerged. Every homeowner who had paid did so within 7 days of receiving a pink envelope. Every receipt included a unique compliance code that matched a line on the HOA ledger I had flagged the day before. The ledger labeled it rebate. I did not tell anyone I was a lawyer. Titles build walls. Instead, I framed the project as a collective audit, a neighborhood habit of checking the math when the numbers feel slippery. People talk when they are treated as partners, not witnesses. They brought out stacks of mail, boxes of forms, photos of installations, and in one case, a voicemail from the contractor promising expedited clearance if the job was scheduled by Friday. I asked to forward it to myself. The owner agreed. On the 4th block, I met a mail carrier on her route and asked a simple factual question: the acceptable mailbox height window she preferred. She lifted an eyebrow toward the range I had written in the notebook and nodded: 41 to 45 inches to the bottom of the box. Anything taller and the truck window game becomes a reach. I thanked her and wrote down the time, turning a casual exchange into a footnote with weight. By sundown, the spreadsheet held 37 entries. Total contractor payments, $12,950, HOA rebates. Recorded between line items for landscaping and pool maintenance, $3,085. Daily fines assessed to those who did not comply, $6,200 with interest compounding like a storm cloud. The numbers did not merely sing. They harmonized in a key called self-dealing. I drafted a demand letter that night. It cited the state nonprofit corporation statute, the HOA Act, and the governing document's own inspection and amendment provisions. It asserted that the mailbox standard had not been properly adopted, that any enforcement was ultra vires, and that any money taken under color of that enforcement formed an unjust enrichment. I enclosed the USPS guidance, photographs, and an offer to mediate in exchange for immediate suspension of fines. 10 days to respond, or I would file a complaint with the state regulator and seek injunctive relief. The next morning, the community received a newsletter styled like a military order. The board framed the mailbox issue as a war against disorder. Non-compliant owners were labeled as risks to property values. It promised swift lien filings for continued refusal. The signature at the bottom looked triumphant, the way ink looks when it forgets paper can be copied. I did not reply to the newsletter. I sent my letter certified, retained the receipt, and emailed a courtesy PDF to the manager so no one could pretend surprise. Then I requested a disciplinary hearing on my own case and on behalf of 3 neighbors who signed authorizations. If power wanted a stage, I would push all the lights to high. On the 10th day, the response arrived, not as reason but as schedule. The board set a hearing for the following week in the clubhouse, promised counsel present, and encouraged affected owners to bring their documents. The performance would proceed as planned. That night, I labeled binders and stuck color-coded tabs to the edges until my fingertips ached. Preparation is a kind of mercy. It keeps the blood calm when the room turns hot. The house grew quiet. Outside, the contractor's truck rolled by again, slower this time as if reading the faces behind curtains. I turned off the lamp and let the dark settle. The hearing would be theater. I planned to bring proof that the set was made of cardboard. The clubhouse smelled like carpet shampoo and staged authority. Folding chairs formed neat rows facing a long table where the board sat under a banner that read, "Community First." On one end, a man in a crisp suit stacked legal pads he would never fill with ink. On the other, the president arranged papers into small defensive citadels, glancing up only to count faces. The room hummed with the low voltage of contained anger. I took a seat at the front with my binders and a portable document camera I had used in courtrooms with better acoustics. A dozen neighbors filled the first 3 rows, clutching notices and receipts. The manager called the meeting to order with the same tone used for pool closures and parking passes. But the agenda lilted around the mailbox item as if it were a harmless detour on the way to committee updates. Procedure matters, so I began where they had been casual. I asked the chair to identify the specific rule at issue, the date of its adoption, the notice to the membership, the quorum that carried it, and the recorded amendment number. The board's attorney adjusted his glasses and offered a general statement about the board's authority to create and enforce architectural standards. Authority, I reminded the room, is a bridge you can walk only if the supports exist. Mine were printed and tabbed. Exhibit by exhibit, the cardboard softened. The bylaws required member notice for material rule changes. The minutes from the December meeting showed no quorum, no recorded vote, and a vague note about committee finalization. The architectural committee consisted of 2 people, one related to the president, the other connected to the contractor. The financials reflected referral income. The USPS manual said the quiet part out loud. The allowable mailbox height was lower than the approved design. I placed a photograph under the camera. A mail carrier straining out a truck window to reach a mailbox lip that sat 6 inches too high. Below it, a measurement tape caught the number with the precision of a second hand at noon. The screen at the back flickered as the image scaled up, and a murmur moved through the rows like wind crossing tall grass. The attorney raised process objections. I answered them with the calm of someone who knew the rules better than the script he brought. The notice requirements were not advisory. The conflict of interest policy was not decorative. Referral fees funneled through a nonprofit without member knowledge were not a rounding error. The power to fine was contingent on the power to adopt. A bridge without supports is a fall disguised as a walkway. I saved the foreclosure threat for last. I displayed the template letter with the bold line at the bottom and let the room read it in silence. Then I placed the ledger line that showed a neighbor already assessed more in fines than a month's mortgage. The audience shifted. Worry turned to something steadier. The president's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a water bottle. She stood, whispered to the attorney, and stepped away from the table, disappearing through a side door that led to a hallway with framed photos of community Easter egg hunts and summer barbecues. The board recessed for 10 minutes. The attorney's jaw tightened around the pause like a man using teeth in place of rope. I remained at the podium, not triumphant, not angry, just unwilling to leave the record gap where consequences like to hide. Neighbors approached with small notes, extra receipts, an email, a copy of a text. I slid them into the folder marked supplements, labeled them with the date and the initials of the person who provided them, and waited for the room to return to its seats. When the president did not come back, the vice president resumed the chair with the fragile steadiness of a substitute teacher, walking into a class already in motion. The attorney recommended a closed session. The board huddled, voices low, eyes darting toward the rows. I watched the clock at the back wall move through its minute while the room held its breath. The decision would expose the bones of what this had been all along, a test of what power could get away with when no one asked for the paperwork. Break to Chapter 5. The board returned with faces arranged into neutral masks. The vice president announced an immediate suspension of mailbox enforcement, a reversal of all related fines, and a commitment to commission an independent audit of contracts and referral arrangements. The attorney's voice provided the legal scaffolding around the decision, but the tone carried the weight of a tide turning because the shoreline no longer wished to be hit. The room stayed still for a beat, as if collective gravity needed to rediscover itself. Then a current of relief moved over the rows. Not applause, not triumph. Just the release that comes when someone takes a boot off a neck. The vice president continued, reading from a page that had clearly been drafted during the recess. All homeowners who purchased the approved mailbox under pressure would be offered refunds. An emergency membership meeting would be scheduled to address vacancies and authorize a bylaws review committee. The president, the statement concluded, had submitted a resignation to be effective immediately. The last line landed without ceremony. There was no explanation, no goodbye, just absence where a signature had been. It was fitting. Power exercised without transparency tends to leave as quietly as it takes. Over the next week, the clubhouse became a paperwork clinic. The manager, suddenly fluent in deadlines, posted refund forms and an audit engagement letter from a reputable firm with no ties to anyone on the board. Minutes from the hearing went up on the portal the same day they were approved, along with a simple acknowledgement. The board had erred. The words did not fix the harm, but they signaled the new current. A neighborhood like a ship changes direction by moving the rudder first, then the hull. The contractor's truck did not return. A notice appeared on their website offering complete cooperation with any inquiry. The audit would test the sincerity of that promise. Meanwhile, homeowners compared notes in driveways and cul-de-sacs, recounting how quickly fear had moved them to pay. Shame dissolved under daylight. No one owed silence to a process that had betrayed them. Several neighbors asked me to run for the board. I declined. I explained that my best work here was behind the scenes. I offered instead to draft a set of model policies, conflict of interest rules with mandatory disclosures, procurement procedures with competitive bidding, an enforcement matrix tied to recorded rules, and a document retention schedule that did not rely on someone's attic. I wrote them over 3 evenings, structuring each policy with a preamble that reminded future readers why words on paper matter when temptation wears a friendly face. The emergency meeting drew a larger crowd than any summer cookout. Ballots filled, hands raised, and people who had never spoken at a microphone took turns saying what they needed to say without naming names or picking at wounds. The vice president, now interim president, promised a culture of minutes that said more than they obscured. The board voted to adopt a simple mailbox standard, comply with USPS height, maintain neat appearance, obtain prior approval for design changes that deviate from existing neighborhood character. No vendor endorsements, no referral income, no ambush fines. For a moment there was nothing to fight. The quiet felt unfamiliar. Then a neighbor approached with a wrinkle no one had anticipated. 2 properties had already received lien notices, recorded at the county clerk's office. Suspension of enforcement would not erase public records. Titles had shadows now. The new board looked at me the way people look at a mechanic who has just fixed the engine but hears the transmission grind. I nodded and collected the case numbers. The fight had changed shape, not ended. The last mile would hold the lesson. Public records do not vanish because an apology appears on a website. Liens live on paper that sits under fluorescent lights in rooms that gather dust at the edges. I drove to the county clerk's office with a folder of resolutions, the suspension notice, and notarized statements from the board. The clerk recognized the HOA name before I finished my sentence. Community disputes leave a footprint the way a boot leaves a print in wet soil, clear, deep, and a little messy around the edges. Releases of lien required signatures, seals, and the ritual choreography of government. Forms that duplicate forms, fees that purchase the privilege of correcting someone else's error. I moved through the steps with patience tuned by years of watching processes yield to persistence. By noon, certified releases were stamped and queued for indexing. By afternoon, copies were in my neighbor's hands. Credit bureaus received dispute packets with exhibits and letters from the new board, confirming the liens had been filed in error. 2 weeks later, confirmation arrived that the negative marks would be removed. Relief announced itself not as celebration but as sleep returning to people who had misplaced it. Refund checks landed in mailboxes that suddenly mattered only as mailboxes again. The audit report arrived a month later, its language dry, its findings decisive. The contractor relationship had been informal at best, improper at worst. Referral payments had flowed through categories designed to avoid questions. The report recommended restitution beyond refunds, a moratorium on unilateral standards, mandatory member votes for material design changes, annual compliance training for board members who, until now, wore authority like a costume rather than a duty. The interim president asked me to stand at the next meeting and explain the policies I had drafted. I declined the podium and suggested a different ceremony. Post the policies, publish the minutes, announce the budget, then host a Saturday morning coffee under the oaks. No microphones, no lectern, just neighbors and questions and the kind of conversation that knits a street back together after someone has pulled at the stitches. They did, and the turnout matched the emergency meeting, only this time the atmosphere felt like a repair rather than a reckoning. The mail carrier attended and laughed when someone rolled out a measuring stick. We made a game of it. Mailbox check-in day, a row-by-row tour with tape measures and small bubble levels, kids holding clipboards like junior engineers. It turned what had been an instrument of fear into an instrument of fellowship. Compliance became a shared habit rather than a cudgel. Beauty returned to meaning something larger than uniform posts under a single vendor's invoice. I never announced my profession. Word traveled anyway the way useful facts do, but the real work had not been a bar card. It had been a refusal to be hurried past the paperwork. The president who resigned did not reappear. The story of her tenure compressed to an anecdote told to new residents as a caution. Trust the process when the process is worthy of trust. Demand the documents when it is not. On the day the last refund cleared, I sat on the porch and watched a dad teach his kid to ride a bike along the curve of the cul-de-sac. The child wobbled, then found balance in that mysterious way all wobbling things do, when forward motion persuades fear to loosen its grip. The mailbox at the end of my driveway stood at 44 inches. Plain and serviceable, unremarkable in every way that matters. That evening I filed the binders on a shelf. Evidence becomes history when the lesson lands. The lesson was simple enough to fit on a note card. When power draws a line in the sand, ask who brought the ruler. Then ask to see it. Then measure it yourself. If the numbers don't match, don't raise your voice first. Raise your exhibits. The HOA president didn't know I was a lawyer. It turned out that was never the point. The board didn't need a lawyer to be better. It needed a neighborhood that knew the shape of its own rights, and a paper trail sturdy enough to carry the weight of that knowledge from one meeting to the next, and from one president to whoever came after. The checks cashed. The liens dissolved. The audit's recommendations moved from paper to practice. And the street settled into the ordinary peace that follows a storm that has done its damage and spent its drama, leaving behind cleaner air and, if we were paying attention, clearer rules about where the sky ends and the roofs begin.